Richard got sad, and then more sad, and more sad, and then we left to go to our hotel across the street.
For years, people have pointed to one scene, one movie, as the moment that killed Gene Wilder's career. The story is simple, and it's easy to believe. A comedic genius makes a terrible film, the world rejects it, and he just fades away. It's the kind of rise and fall story Hollywood loves to tell. We see it all the time. A single failure becomes the final word on a brilliant career. It's what people say when they talk about stars who burn out. They point to his last few films, movies like Haunted Honeymoon or Another You, and they nod like they've figured it all out. They see bad reviews and low box office numbers as the smoking gun that forced one of cinema's greatest talents into retirement, but what if that whole story is a lie? What if the real reason Gene Wilder left Hollywood is far more heartbreaking, and has almost nothing to do with a bad movie, but everything to do with a personal tragedy that reshaped his entire life, and a deep disgust with the industry he once loved? The idea that one flop ended his career isn't just wrong, it's an insult to the man and the deliberate, brave choices he made. We're going to dismantle that myth, piece by piece. In its place, we'll build a true portrait of a man driven not by failure, but by love, integrity, and a quiet refusal to sell his soul. This is the real story of what happened to Gene Wilder. To get why the bad movie myth is so popular, you have to look at the final chapter of his filmography. The late 80s and early 90s were, commercially speaking, not great for him. After a golden run in the 70s, where he was a key ingredient in some of the greatest comedies ever made, the movies started to change. The kinds of films he was brilliant in, witty, character-driven, and often tender comedies, were being pushed aside for a new kind of blockbuster, louder, bigger, and more focused on spectacle than performance, and this is where the evidence for his decline starts to pile up. Take 1986's Haunted Honeymoon. This film was Wilder's baby. He wrote it, directed it, and starred in it alongside the love of his life, Gilda Radner. It was supposed to be a fun throwback to the old dark house thrillers he loved as a kid. It had all the right ingredients: Wilder's manic energy, Radner's incredible charm, and their friend Dom DeLuise. But the movie was torn apart by critics and bombed at the box office. It grossed just over $8 million on a $9 million budget and vanished. So for anyone looking for a turning point, Haunted Honeymoon looks like Exhibit A. A passion project that failed spectacularly. Then, just 3 years later, you get See No Evil, Hear No Evil, his third movie with Richard Pryor. Their first two films, Silver Streak and Stir Crazy, were massive hits. This one, not so much. Critics were mostly unkind. They loved the chemistry between the two stars but hated the lazy script. Then came their final film together in 1991, Another You Star. That movie was an absolute train wreck. Critics called it stubbornly unfunny and a spectacularly mirthless comedy. It currently has a 5% on Rotten Tomatoes. The box office was even worse, with a historic 78% drop in its second weekend. Another You would be Gene Wilder's very last feature film. So, the story writes itself, right? An aging star, a string of flops, and a final, embarrassing bomb that sends him into exile. It's clean. It's simple. It lets us look at his life like a business transaction. The industry chewed him up and spit him out. He lost his magic. This is the story people tell because it's easy. It doesn't require knowing anything about the man, just his IMDb page. Case closed. But, is it? That simple story starts to fall apart the second you look a little closer. Because it just doesn't fit the man. This is Gene Wilder we're talking about. The man who could show you pure vulnerability and complete chaos with just one look. This was Leo Bloom in The Producers, a role that got him an Oscar nomination for his first big movie. This was the Waco Kid in Blazing Saddles. This was Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, that's Frankenstein, who co-wrote another Oscar-nominated script and gave one of the greatest comedic performances ever. And of course, he was Willy Wonka. An iconic performance that was magical and menacing, warm and terrifying all at once. Does that sound like a guy who would be so shaken by a few bad movies that he just quit? The timeline doesn't even make sense. The supposed end of his career wasn't the end at all. In 1994, he starred in his own sitcom, Something Wilder. It only lasted a season, but the will to create was obviously still there. But here's the real kicker. Almost a decade after his last movie, he did a guest spot on the hit show Will and Grace from 2002 to 2003, playing the eccentric Mr. Stein. He wasn't just a nostalgia act, he was brilliant. The moment he walked on set, the live audience gave him a standing ovation. And for that performance, his very last on screen, Gene Wilder won a Primetime Emmy Award. Let that sink in for a second. The story goes that his career died in 1991. Yet 12 years later, he gave an Emmy-winning performance on one of the biggest shows on TV. That's not what happens when you're forced out of Hollywood. That's not the resume of a has-been. That's the move of an artist choosing his moments, an artist who is still in total command of his talent. The idea that his career was killed by failure just isn't true. It ignores the most important person in the story, Gene Wilder himself. He didn't get fired. He wasn't kicked out. The truth is much deeper. He looked at the state of the business he had dedicated his life to, and he decided he just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. And that decision wasn't made because of box office numbers. It was forged by a personal tragedy that would change him forever. To find the real beginning of the end of Gene Wilder's acting career, you don't look on a movie set. You have to go back to August 13, 1981. That's the day he met Gilda Radner on the set of the film Hanky Panky. She was a force of nature, an original Saturday Night Live superstar. For Gilda, it was love at first sight. She wrote in her memoir that when she met him, her life went from black and white to technicolor. Gene was a little more hesitant. They were both married at the time, and he found her energy both amazing and overwhelming. But you couldn't deny their connection. They married in 1984, and their life together was full of affection, creativity, and intense emotion. Their friend Mel Brooks said they were best friends, a perfect match. But it wasn't a simple fairy tale. Wilder later wrote with brutal honesty about their relationship, saying, "We didn't get along well, and that's a fact. We just loved each other, and that's a fact." It was a real, complicated, passionate love. They made 3 movies together, including the ill-fated Haunted Honeymoon. And it was during the filming of that movie in 1986 that the first sign of tragedy appeared. Radner had a miscarriage, a heartbreaking blow for a couple that desperately wanted kids, but the miscarriage was hiding something far worse. Gilda started having debilitating symptoms, constant exhaustion, fevers, and intense pain. For nearly a year, doctors kept getting it wrong. They told her it was Epstein-Barr virus, or just stress. Wilder grew more and more frustrated, knowing in his gut something was terribly wrong. Finally, in October 1986, they got an answer. It was the worst one possible. Gilda Radner had stage 4 ovarian cancer. What followed was a brutal 3-year battle. Gilda went through surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation. Through it all, Gene was her rock. He learned how to give her treatments, he cared for her, and he basically put his own life and career on pause to be by her side. For a short time, she went into remission, but the cancer came back. In May 1989, Gilda was admitted to the hospital for a CT scan. As they wheeled her away, she got scared and pleaded with him, "Help me out of here." She was afraid she wouldn't wake up. He calmed her down and promised he'd be there when she got back. She was right to be afraid. She fell into a coma during the scan and never woke up. 3 days later, on May 20, 1989, Gilda Radner died with Wilder holding her hand. She was just 42. Wilder was destroyed. In his memoir, Kiss Me Like a Stranger, he said, I was shouting at the walls. I kept thinking to myself, this doesn't make sense. But in the middle of all that pain, he found a new purpose. His grief was mixed with a burning anger. He believed that Gilda's cancer could have been caught earlier if the doctors had just asked the right questions. He found out she had a family history of ovarian cancer, a critical detail no one ever asked about. In that moment, he wrote that he could hear Gilda's voice in his head, telling him, don't. Just sit there, dummy, do something. The death of his wife wasn't the end of his story. It was the start of a new, urgent mission. Gene Wilder the actor was about to become Gene Wilder the advocate, and Hollywood just didn't matter anymore. After Gilda's death, Gene Wilder's priorities changed completely. The world of movies, of scripts and sets, suddenly felt pointless and hollow compared to the brutal reality of his loss. His focus wasn't on the next role, it was on honoring his wife's memory and making sure her story could save other people. He channeled his anger into action. In 1991, he testified before a House subcommittee, speaking with a quiet, intense passion about the need for more federal funding for cancer research and awareness. He wasn't there as a movie star, he was there as a widower who watched the system fail the person he loved most. His testimony was a key part of securing $30 million for ovarian cancer research, but he didn't stop there. Gilda had found a lot of comfort in a cancer support group, and it was her dream to create those same safe places for patients all over the country. Making that dream a reality became Wilder's new purpose. Working with Gilda's therapist and others, he co-founded Gilda's Club. The first one opened in New York City in 1995, with its signature red door, offering free emotional and social support for anyone living with cancer. Gilda had once joked that cancer gave her membership to an elite club I'd rather not belong to. Wilder helped turn that dark joke into a beacon of hope. He used his fame not to sell tickets, but to raise money for a cause that was now the center of his life. His last feature film, Another You, came out in 1991, the same year he was testifying before Congress. The idea that he was sitting around, heartbroken over a bad movie, is just absurd when you look at what he was actually doing. He wasn't retreating from the world because of failure. He was engaging with it more deeply than ever before. He walked away from the fiction of Hollywood to deal with the harshest facts of life, and he turned a private tragedy into a public legacy that has helped countless people. If you're finding this look into Gene Wilder's real story compelling, and if you believe in uncovering the truth behind the headlines, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We're dedicated to telling the stories that matter, and your support helps us continue that mission. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. While Gilda Radner's death was the main reason Gene Wilder's life changed course, there was another reason he was stepping away. He was completely disillusioned with Hollywood. He wasn't just being pulled away by a new mission, he was also being pushed away by what the movie business had become. It wasn't that Hollywood didn't want him. It was that he no longer wanted what Hollywood was selling. This wasn't some case of sour grapes because his movies weren't hits anymore. This was an artist taking a stand. He saw the world of comedy, his world, being taken over by cheap, lazy, and artless jokes. In an interview in 2013, he said it plainly, "I'm tired of watching the bombing, shooting, killing, swearing and 3D." He wasn't a prude. This is the guy who starred in Blazing Saddles, one of the most wonderfully offensive and brilliant satires ever made. But in that movie, the shock had a point. What he saw in the comedies of the 90s and 2000s was different. He saw swearing used as the punchline itself. He explained his frustration: if someone says, go F yourself, well, if it came from a meaningful place, I'd understand it. But if you go to some movies, can't they just stop and talk, just talk, instead of swearing? That put me off a lot. He felt the craft of comedy was being abandoned for what he called bombs and loudness. He made it clear he was still open to acting, but the right parts just weren't coming. He said he'd get tons of scripts, but maybe only 3 a year were any good. He famously said, "I didn't want to do the kind of junk I was seeing. If something comes along that's really good and I think I would be good for it, I'd be happy to do it." But not too many came along. This wasn't an actor complaining about a lack of offers, it was an actor complaining about a lack of quality offers. The business had changed, and he was an artist who valued subtlety and intelligence in an era that just wanted spectacle and shock. His retirement wasn't a surrender. It was a protest. He would rather not act at all than act in something he didn't respect. When you understand his grief, his new mission, and his artistic disgust, you can look back at those final films differently. They weren't the cause of his retirement, they were the final proof that he was making the right decision. See no evil, hear no evil * in another you were exactly the kind of movies he was starting to hate. They were high-concept studio gimmicks, not stories about real characters. For Another You, the production was a mess, and Richard Pryor's health was sadly declining from multiple sclerosis, which was painful to see on screen. For an actor like Wilder, making a film like that must have felt like a betrayal of the magic he and Pryor once created. The movie's failure was probably less a source of shame for him and more a sad confirmation that he was right about where Hollywood was going. This wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't fulfilling. So he walked away from film. But he didn't stop working entirely. In 1999, he starred in and co-wrote 2 TV movies for A&E, Murder in a Small Town and The Lady in Question. They were well received, and they show that he was still creating, but on his own terms, working on projects he had a hand in writing, far from the studio system. His return for Will and Grace from 2002 to 2003 is the perfect final touch. He didn't do it for the money. He did it because he thought the script was genuinely funny. It was the perfect example of what he'd been saying all along: give him something good, and he'd do it. And when he did, he won an Emmy. It was a final, triumphant grace note, proof that the magic was never gone. It was just waiting for something worthy. After that, he quietly retired from the screen for good. So the mystery of what happened to Gene Wilder isn't a mystery at all. There was no single moment that ended his career. It was a slow, deliberate departure made by a man who had been completely changed by life. On one hand, he was a man transformed by loss. Gilda Radner's death didn't just break his heart, it broke him open and gave him a new purpose. The work he did for Gilda's club was real. It saved lives. How could a movie script about some goofy mistaken identity ever compete with that? It couldn't. On the other hand, he was an artist with integrity, watching the art form he loved become something he found crass and alienating. He was a craftsman in an age of mass production, and he refused to make junk. So when he felt like junk was all that was being offered, he walked, faced with that choice: a life of meaning and peace, or a career making movies he didn't respect. It wasn't really a choice at all. It was the only way forward for a man like him. And so, he started a new chapter. Gene Wilder, the actor, became Gene Wilder, the writer. He settled in Connecticut with his 4th wife, Karen, whom he married in 1991. There, he found a quiet, lasting happiness. He published his beautiful memoir, Kiss Me Like a Stranger, in 2005, and then wrote several novels. Writing gave him what acting couldn't anymore: control, peace, and a life close to the people he loved. He once said, "I can write, take a break, come out, have a glass of tea, give my wife a kiss, and go back in and write some more. It's not so bad. I am really lucky." He didn't disappear, he just chose a different kind of spotlight. In the end, the common story about Gene Wilder's career is more than just wrong, it's a disservice to his memory. To say a bad movie ended his career is to paint him as a victim. The truth is so much more powerful. Gene Wilder was the one in charge. He was an artist of incredible talent, but he was also a man who loved deeply and suffered a terrible loss. He looked at his life and made a courageous choice. He chose purpose over profit. He chose peace over the chaos of an industry he no longer respected. He left Hollywood not as a failure, but as a man who realized there were more important things in life than being a movie star. His true legacy isn't just the laughter from Young Frankenstein or the magic of Willy Wonka. It's in the quiet dignity of his exit, and in the thousands of lives touched by the compassion of Gilda's Club. He didn't lose his career, he reclaimed his life. And that's a better story than any movie ever made.